I was talking to my son on the phone just now, and we were talking about where he's studying in school, and he's studying the Holocaust in school. And we were talking about, whether or not such things could happen in the United States. And I said, in a semi-serious way, that at some of the academic jobs that I've held, I've entertained myself during long meetings by going through the people in the room in my mind and asking myself which one of them would have spoken up if they'd been Germans during the 1940s, and which would have gone along with it. And he said, "Do you do that at Deep Springs meetings?" And I said, "There's no reason to do that at Deep Springs meetings, because it's amazing the way people do not hesitate to speak up." And at that moment, Bob Gatje's face popped into my mind. I've only known Joe Wallace a short time, but he's been very genteel to me in my confusion, and I certainly appreciate that very much. Those of you who know Beth Thomas, who's going to speak a little bit more about Bob, many of you know, most of you know, but some may not, that Beth's father was the dean director of Deep Springs in the 40s, and that he was the dean director during the time that Bob was here, and that therefore you've known each other for a while.
We agreed not to mention exactly how long.
But it's been at least 39 years.
And neither of us could have ever imagined being here under these circumstances.
So I know Beth's looking forward to this event, and I think it's a real testament to the long-term strength of Deep Springs that she's here to do this, and I want to make sure that in introducing her to note that she is much more to Deep Springs at this point. Cy Whitman's daughter, she has been on the board for a great many years now, less than 29, and she's been, to my eye, a very impressive and formative major force on that board, and all to the good. And I've really relied upon her and leaned on her very much, and I appreciate that. And so she's now vice chair of the board. Dave Hitz is unavoidably absent, but send his apologies. But it's good because it'll be nice to hear from Beth.
Before you run off, David, I'm sure I speak for all of us that we would like to somehow convey our thanks to the SB and all the other people that worked so hard on the reunion. Well, I am honored to present the Deep Springs Medal to Bob Gatje of the class of 1944. And it's especially nice that Sue and Bob's daughters and grandchildren were able to be here too. Welcome. And I'd just like to... The Deep Springs Medal is the highest honor that can be awarded by the college. It is awarded to alumni whose lives exemplify the ideals of selfless service and visionary leadership that L.L. Nunn sought to advance when he founded the college in 1917. The previous recipients include Bill Allen and Jack Newell, who we are glad to have with us tonight. Bob fully deserves to take his place among these Deep Springs giants. Bob came to Deep Springs in 1944 during the war. On leaving Deep Springs in 1946, he volunteered, was not drafted, to serve in the United States Army. After that, he attended Cornell University's College of Architecture, where he received his bachelor's degree with highest honors and was a Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill Scholar, as well as a Telluride Scholar. He continued his architectural studies in London as a Fulbright Scholar. Bob's professional career has been an outstanding one by any measure. After graduation from Cornell, he joined Marcel Boyer's firm, first as an associate, then founder with Boyer of Marcel Boyer Architect in Paris, and finally as a partner in Marcel Boyer and Associates. As co-designer with Boyer, Bob built many prize-winning buildings. He continued the design and development of an entire French ski resort, plus major manufacturing and research centers for leading corporations. One of the buildings he worked on is IBM France's Laboratories, which has been named a monument of modern architecture by the French government. In the mid-'80s, Bob was the lead partner of Gatje Papachristou Smith Architects. He was responsible, among other things, for the award-winning Broward County Main Library in Fort Lauderdale, which I looked up, and according to one of the sources, the building itself is a stunning example of modern architecture, featuring a cascade of windows and terraces. Finally, Bob was the administrative partner for the New York office of Richard Meyer and Partners, where he worked on the Channel Plus building in Paris and the City Hall for The Hague. And one thing I want to ask you more about that later, Bob, is whether that's in the great tradition of Dutch city halls. I assume it is. Bob wrote a lovely memoir of Marcel Boyer. Most recently, he has published Great Public Squares and Architect's Selection, which many of us have had the pleasure of reviewing with him. Throughout his career, Bob has served both his profession and the larger society. He has held positions of leadership and honor in the American Institute of Architects at both the local and national levels, including the presidency of the New York chapter. He has served as a member of the Alumni Council of the Cornell College of Architecture, a member of the Junior Council of the Museum of Modern Art, and a trustee of the New York Hall of Science, and chaired the ultimately successful committee to save the Whitney Museum. He became a trustee of the Roosevelt Institute in 1996. Bill Vanden Heuvel shared the following comments on Bob's service as a trustee of the Institute. Quote, Bob's sense of civic purpose has been shown time and again. I can certainly bear witness to it for what he has done for the Roosevelt Institute. He had a significant role in building the Henry A. Wallace Visitor and Conference Center at Hyde Park, a 4-year effort that required patience, fortitude, and brilliance, all of which he brought to the task to help make it happen. He is now my close associate in working to build the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island in the East River of New York, fulfilling a design by the late Louis Kahn that will give New York and our country an architectural treasure. The reason why we here tonight especially love Bob, of course, is his unflagging devotion to Deep Springs and our sister organization, Telluride. Bob was SB president and student trustee in the 1940s. After attending Cornell, he was one of the leaders in keeping TA and DS working together over many decades. He served as Telluride's president from 1953 to 55 and founded and long ran ADSTA, the Alumni of Deep Springs and Telluride Association. He was a highly regarded member of TDS from 1974 to 1982, and after that time, his important service to the college included chairing the Withrow Commission from the late 1980s to 2004. During the campaign for Deep Springs, Bob chaired the building committee and was responsible for the renovation of the building in which we stand tonight, as well as construction of the wonderful student residence across the circle and other projects. And I've heard from unnamed sources that while serving on the building committee, Bob forgot a very significant reality. Neither he nor Jim Allen remembered the 3-hour time difference between New York and California. They often called Aird Cottage at 8 a.m. Eastern Time to question Jack Newell on the progress of the project. Most importantly, Bob also demonstrated that losing a battle over an issue at Deep Springs does not impact his intense loyalty. He still longingly views the roadway around the circle and dreams of a ribbon of asphalt. Bob has also served year in and year out as the 1940s decade chair. I quote here from Ed Wesley, "As 1940s decade chair of the Deep Springs alumni giving effort, Bob's influence is stunning. Each year, the alumni from the 1940s are by far the most generous and numerous donors to the college. This is, of course, partly due to the influence of the legendary Simon Whitney, but built upon by Bob's persistent and indefatigable efforts." I would like to close these remarks with two tributes from Bob's peers. Mel Cohn observes that from day one, Bob was the walking incarnation of what LL and the faculty of Deep Springs would have wanted us all to be, and what the rest of us aspired to be. And from Bill Vanden Heuvel, Bob's contributions to Deep Springs, which are vast, inspiring, and unending, emerge from his soul, which, having passed over a cattle guard as he arrived as a very young student, never left the valley. I would also like to mention how happy and proud my dad would be if he were here tonight. Bob, please come up and receive your medal. The front of the medal reads Deep Springs College 1917, and the back reads in grateful recognition of a life of leadership and service consistent with the ideals and goals of Deep Springs College, Robert F. Gatje, 2011. Is that good?
Thank you.
This has all of the medal winners, and there you are.
Well, first of all, of course, I want to express my pleasure at the receipt of this honor, and my thanks to the trustees of Deep Springs for awarding it to me, someone who has at times in the past been, I know, something of a pain in the neck. Thank you all. For me, this is a great and moving moment. Now the question is, what to say in response? And I think I'll tell you some stories about Deep Springs. Not history, that's Jack's business, but stories as I remember them. So I ask you to follow me back to 1944. Because there are very few of us still around who remember it yourselves. In the spring of 1944, the school was just 27 years old. It had the feel of a great institution, or so we were told. Today it's going on 94. 67 more years of ups and downs. It may be useful to hear a little about what it was like in its youth. Ken Mahoney had been accepted as a student, and he told Mr. Cahill, an English professor at Evander Childs High School, about Deep Springs. When Cahill came to Brooklyn Tech as head of the English department, he brought along with him a handout. It wasn't even a brochure, and he left it on the desk of the college advisor's office. In the spring of 1944, the Allies were on the edge of Rome. The Nazis had been stopped just outside Moscow, and Marshall and Eisenhower were planning D-Day for June. but there was still a war to win and a draft to be filled. Directors had just been snatched from Deep Springs for more important things like the Manhattan Project. And it seemed as if students no sooner arrived than they were being summoned out for their physicals. Trustee Jack Leyland twisted the arm of his cousin Simon Newcomb Whitney, the grandson of America's first great astronomer. According to Bob Sproul, when I was composing Cy's eulogy years later, Deep Springer Whitney was also the most brilliant man in Telluride Association. Leyland asked him to give up his career as a federal economist and come out to Happy Valley with his new bride Eunice and his even newer first child, Beth. This is what they looked like at the time. And there's another copy of this being passed around. He joined a refugee couple named Bergel, who had just escaped from Berlin with only one PhD, and they needed a job to work on the second. And there was his old friend Elmer Marker Johnson, former Cornell English teacher and chancellor at Telluride Association, who also needed a job since the Marines had just taken over Telluride House. And here's a marvelous picture of Johnny. He's wearing what I suppose you wear in Ithaca, New York. I remember that here in the valley he used to wear a little pigskin skull cap. I think his bald spot from getting sunburned. As for students, the entry bar had been dropped, and boys at 16 were being welcomed right after their junior year in high school. My father had stopped in at the college advisor's office at Tech a little early to get advice about where his son should start studying engineering. Someone gave him the handout saying, "You know, we don't know much about this place, but he may be interested in it." And this is what that looked like. Absolutely authentic. Now, I can't really remember exactly what made me think about giving up my senior year, editorship of the school newspaper, and all those good stuff that you wait for in anticipation about graduation from high school, but something about California and cowboys must have appealed to one who had never been west of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Johnny Johnson sent out an application blank enclosed with a letter graced by his memorable signature. He used a split-point pen to stab out the punctuation that we all remember. And those of you who may have seen one of his letters will never forget that signature at the bottom of my application letter from Johnny. So I composed one of those dreadful documents that always embarrass alumni when reading through their files.
Sorry.
We realized that we would never be admitted today. But the school needed students, and Parker Bailey, who had grown up in the household of L.L. Nunn, came out to Brooklyn to interview me and to convince my parents. A few weeks later, I was in the law office of Windsor Putnam, who had a photo of the thumb on the wall behind him at his desk. He didn't tell me why he had left school early. It had something to do with not chopping wood for the cook. And then a call from Cy, who had just come in from Chicago, and he interviewed me walking alongside him on Park Avenue as he headed to the lost and found at Grand Central to recover Eunice's suitcase. A few days later, I got this formal acceptance in the mail. You can barely see it, but there's another copy there. It's a photocopy of the reality, which I still have. Now, I'm not kidding. This is real. And it's in pencil on a 3x5 page from his notebook. And it reads, June 8, 1944, Dear Mr. Gatje, This is to notify you formally, there it is, of your admission to Deep Springs. If you cannot accept, please let me know. Otherwise, we will expect you in September. I will notify you later, early in July, exactly what date. You can write us with any questions you have about Deep Springs. Simon & Whitney, Director, Deep Springs. My arrival had been put off in order to permit me to pass my last summer at Camp Rising Sun. Some of you have heard of that. Of course, I had told Don Claudy, my best friend at both Tech and Camp, all about Deep Springs. So he applied and he was also accepted. Now this procedure led in later years to Deep Springers named Weinstein, McCarthy, and Karplus, all from Brooklyn Tech and the same summer camp. If this astounds those of you who have passed through today's procedures, it should. Several members of the student body had been summoned to Los Angeles for draft physicals in June, but 3 were rejected, and they asked to return. The student body just didn't like Whiting and Childs, and they told the director they shouldn't come back. Cy overruled whatever power the student body had in those days, and Al is today one of the country's leading scholars of communism in China. Barney was chosen to be the first of our only 2 Rhodes Scholars, won the Kusavitsky Prize, and later returned to Deep Springs as its president. Trustee Carol Nunn Whitman told Cy that Jules Riskin couldn't return because in the meantime, Mel Cohn had been accepted to fill the Jewish quota. Don and I met Mel at Penn Station in September, and Bob Peters joined us in Chicago as we were changing trains. Armin Kelly enjoyed scaring us all about scorpions over lunch at the Stevens Hotel. And this is a stopover at Douglas, Arizona in the Golden State Limited. Gatje and Claudy, very well dressed in those days. 3 days later, we got off the railroad station at Reno, Nevada at 2 in the morning with 4 hours to kill before the inland stages left for Big Pine. I remember us being met by the trustees' sedan, but there must have been another vehicle because we were not the only, there were more than only 4 of us, because there was a little gray-haired old lady who wore a kerchief and spoke no English. The next time I met Uma Burgell was years later in Los Angeles, where she wore blue hair and harlequin sunglasses. The student driver dropped us and our bags at the end of what was then the student dormitory, and he sped off to park the car at the garage. We walked in along a long corridor covered with brown linoleum and not a soul in sight. Then a door flew open and Barney Childs came into view. A small goatee matched the hair that had been repainted to his bare skull, and he loped barefooted toward us with a handshake and said, "You must be the new guys. Child's the name." After which he wheeled on his heel, returned to his room, and left us. Someone else must have taken us in tow and shown us to our own rooms. I remember that mine was empty because my roommate and student body president, Don Novelli, had just remanded himself to a week at the lower ranch for smoking a cigarette. Now, of course, there were other adults in the community at that time, besides the faculty of Cy, Johnny, and the Burgells. There was Charlie Ellmeyer, who took over as ranch manager after the brother-in-law of trustee Harold Waldo was dismissed for cattle wrestling. Ellmeyer had stayed on rather broad-mindedly after his wife Ethel was discovered to have had an affair with student Charles Collingwood. Jerry Mack, now he was a real cowboy because he'd appeared in a number of Warner Brothers westerns, or so he told us over Saturday night poker down at the Lower Ranch. And Madame Fair, she was our cook. And you could always tell it was Tuesday when tongue and heart turned up at lunch. Her son Charlie later and memorably interrupted a milk and cookies late evening snack at the boarding house with word that his new radio had just picked up the news that we had dropped an atomic bomb on the Japs. He was laughed out of the room for reading too much science fiction, and we returned to the isolation policy. We learned about it the next day when the LA Times came up. My second day was as a general worker and had been spent shoveling parts of the horse corral into the low loader with Barney. He was to become my intellectual mentor, but he asked that day, after 4 hours together, "Gatje, haven't you ever read any books?" The first day, I'd been given a chopping block, hatchet, and a large number of chickens, with instructions to whirl them around my head after they had lost theirs. And when I had begun my work, the Black Sierras had just disappeared behind a cloud bank. And by the time I had finished, the mountains had reappeared pure white. Deep Springs has meant many things to many people. Public service, mountain trekking, organic gardening, and cutthroat politics. I learned something of responsibility from Cy and beauty from Barney and the Burgells. Deep Springs was very good, but it's much better today. It's very, very important for all of you to realize what a treasure you have in your hands and to preserve it as best you can. Thank you.